Close your eyes and picture yourself lying on a hard wooden floor, going through the darkest mental health crisis of your life. Your chest is tight, your mind is racing, you are looking for any reason to stay alive, you feel completely out of control, and there's this mesmerizing, hyper-articulate spiritual guru standing over you, locking her eyes onto yours, and giving you this exact therapeutic advice. Imagine your own death. Picture your funeral. Picture your cold corpse. Yes, this is actually happening in our world. This is Teal Swan, and she is publicly teaching thousands of online followers her philosophy that suicide is our safety net and our reset button. Teal Swan has followers who have ended their lives while fully immersed in her digital echo chamber and teachings. Despite warnings issued by clinical psychologists, she is still at it. Welcome back to Do You Want to Hear Something Awful? I'm your host, Alyson, and today we are going to talk about the multi-million-dollar spiritual empire of international guru Teal Swan. This is not just new age toxic positivity. This is the monetization of trauma. We're going to be talking about how she takes advantage of web algorithms, her spiritual retreat that exploits labor from traumatized people, her unverified memory regression techniques that have even manipulated people's memories to be more traumatic than they were originally, her lies that she's built her entire brand on, and we're going to talk about the wild west of internet wellness and how gurus like Teal Swan will take your deepest psychological wounds and turn them into currency. The core of Teal's spiritual work is her trademark therapeutic protocol that she calls the completion process. It is a 20-step method that she panders as a cure for deep-seated childhood trauma. And she claims that it achieves what traditional clinical psychology can't, which is the total extraction and integration of any suppressed wound. It is heavily plagiarized from specifically internal family systems. She rips off parts work and blends it with her own other somatic experiencing techniques. During a live session, a follower is instructed to mentally regress back to the emotional framework of their earliest childhood memories. They are told to manifest that raw agony in the room. There are clips of people screaming, hyperventilating, thrashing across the floor, and sometimes she will wrap her adult clients in heavy blankets or physically hold them down to simulate an agonizing rebirthing experience. And the physical aspect of this process, where facilitators will pin thrashing clients down or swaddle them tightly in blankets, is an offshoot of rebirthing and holding therapy, which is what was practiced back in asylums and specifically used with women that were deemed insane. And mainstream medical institutions like the American Psychological Association and the American Academy of Pediatrics have rejected these regression techniques as extremely hazardous, not only mentally, but also physically. This reform was sparked by the 2000 death of 10-year-old Candace Newmaker, who suffocated during a rebirthing session in Colorado. She was very fragile and was physically overpowered and forced into hyperventilation. This does not integrate trauma. It actually makes it worse. It activates the brain's survival network and induces panic, helplessness, severe dissociation, all things that happen when you are traumatized. What this group, what Teal Swan celebrates as a spiritual breakthrough, is just a state of shock. And she takes advantage of this state of shock to pull her followers in even more. On top of the screaming and the blanket swaddling, critics and viewers of her documentary were horrified to learn about the extreme somatic sensory techniques that were used at her retreats. Participants have been subjected to water rituals to break down their psychological resistance. And she forcibly held people underwater to the point of feeling like they were literally drowning. She markets this as a revolutionary technique designed to simulate near death or amniotic fluid birthing trauma. But clinical psychologists look at this footage and state what I think should be obvious to all of us. It's waterboarding, and it's masquerading as spiritual wellness, and it triggers physical shock, and it makes a person hyper-suggestible, which again, Teal takes advantage of. It's interesting to hear from survivors of Teal Swan's organization, and particularly the people who have been at her retreat where this happens. On r/Teal Swan Survivor, a user wrote, "She will completely rip open your mind, strip away every single psychological defense mechanism you spent a lifetime building to keep yourself stable, and then the workshop timer hits 0. You are left raw, in terrifying clinical dissociation, and you're told to wander back to your hotel room and integrate it yourself. It's psychological vandalism masquerading as a cure." If you look at her community spaces, her loyal fan base argue that Western therapy is too soft to actually work, and Teal Swan is doing the hardcore method that actually will help somebody heal. A dedicated Teal Swan practitioner defended the intense screaming and restraint by writing, "If you have a deep malignant physical tumor, a real surgeon doesn't just put a band-aid on it and talk about your feelings. They literally have to cut you open with a scalpel, and it is going to look bloody, terrifying, and violent to anyone standing on the outside. Teal is doing emergency psychic surgery. The screaming and the thrashing is just the illness leaving the body." But people, again, who have experienced this have a completely different story. A person who left Teal Swan's retreat reported this. "Traditional psychologists call it trauma-induced shock, but they don't understand the spiritual reality. After hours of hyperventilating and letting the collective energy of the room hold me down, I felt absolute, reality-shattering release. I became completely empty. Teal was the only person on earth who was brave enough to sit there and watch me completely break without blinking, and that is why we trust her." The pressure in that room is completely unspoken but absolute. When you are sitting in front of Teal and the entire crowd is completely silent waiting for your breakthrough, your brain enters fight or flight panic. I watched people completely construct scenarios of horrific childhood abuse that they admitted 10 minutes earlier they had zero memory of, simply because the environment Teal created demands a graphic answer to justify your pain. Teal Swan is pressuring people so much that they are constructing childhood memories. Recovered memory therapy was a discredited approach that actually peaked during the Satanic Panic in the 1980s. Combining an authority figure and a highly emotional room is what creates a breeding ground for these pseudo-memories. A leader will assert that adult anxiety has to be rooted in blocked childhood trauma, and so the client's brain enters a state of narrative compliance. Under this group pressure, the mind bridges the gap between imagination and belief. Your brain will synthesize completely false graphic memories to appease the leader and resolve the social stress you are experiencing. When a facilitator deliberately strips away a client's standard psychological defense mechanisms through forced somatic exhaustion and emotional regression and doesn't have a structured professional cooling off period, it creates what psychologists call traumatic bonding. By leaving the participant completely raw and disoriented, the brain clings to the nearest source of authority for immediate safety. The client becomes intensely suggestible, allowing the guru to seamlessly rewrite their history, their reality, and foster that lifelong codependency on the organization, which, spoiler alert, means income and money for the leader of the organization. Teal did trademark this completion process and actually turned it into a multi-level marketing structure. Yes, you heard me right. Her followers will pay $1,000 for a weekend online training and get a PDF certificate signed by Teal Swan that doesn't really actually hold any weight in the medical or psychological world. Once you get that certificate, you're not done. She requires practitioners to continuously pay the parent company to keep their status active. You have to pay an annual licensing fee to stay listed on her official website directory, and if you don't pay that subscription tax, they take your name off the registry. And you have to funnel your own clients back into buying her books, her meditation tracks, her retreats, and ultimately into becoming practitioners themselves and becoming those distributors that produce even more money for Teal Swan. The certification contract shifts all the legal risk away from Teal Swan and onto the individual practitioner. If a client has a psychotic break or attempts suicide, the corporate parent entity that Teal Swan has created is insulated. There was a deep dive post on r/cults that broke this down. I quote, "The contract you signed to become a certified practitioner is completely diabolical. It explicitly states that you are an independent contractor, not an employee or representative of Teal Swan International. If a practitioner uses her techniques and a client ends up hospitalized or sues for malpractice, Teal's legal team can instantly point to the paperwork and say, not our problem. They are an independent distributor. She takes the compliance fees and the global marketing distribution, and the brainwashed practitioner takes 100% of the legal liability. This allows her to scale her operation globally without having to physically be in the room. By turning her most devoted followers into independent business owners, she creates an army of foot soldiers who act as a human shield for her brand." End quote. Teal Swan has found a way to franchise trauma. I mean, these practitioners are so desperate for her validation. They will pay for titles, set up practices, and act as recruiters. They will find vulnerable people locally, break them down, and then when they get messed up enough, they tell them the only way to truly heal is to fly to Costa Rica and pay $5,000 for the main event with Teal. Now, if somebody doesn't heal from her methods, Teal will diagnose the failing follower with having an unbendable core or an unintegrated soul contract, which basically tells the victim that their soul is fundamentally too stubborn, too rigid, or too deeply aligned with darkness to accept her healing light. There was a survivor who wrote a devastating post summarizing the impact of being told this. Quote, "When the treatment fails, they don't question the treatment, they blame your soul. They look you in the eye and tell you that you are fundamentally unhealable, because you want to stay broken. It leaves people in a state of despair that is 1,000 times worse than the depression they started with." End quote. Teal has an earthly childhood backstory that almost veers into science fiction. She has claimed that she is a six-dimensional alien being from the Arcturian star system who consciously entered into a soul contract before birth to inhabit a human body. According to her, she deliberately chose to experience the darkest, most horrific earthly trauma possible so that she could map the human psyche and bring the blueprint of healing back to humanity. She relies heavily on the concept of the Akashic records, serving as this cosmic authority, and positions herself as an exclusive cosmic archivist who can look into clients' past lives to uncover hidden soul contracts or ancient spiritual bonds. She basically says that she has exclusive extrasensory access to this library of data that regular humans can never see or verify. And so her diagnoses and her process becomes completely beyond intellectual or scientific debate. She's able to say, well, you don't understand it. It's kind of parallel to the idea in the Bible of no eye has seen, no ear has heard. No eye has seen, no ear has heard exactly what Teal Swan has. And so that's something that she uses to her advantage to defend herself. I mean, in her deep dive media catalog, she advanced the theory that Jesus Christ and Lucifer were the same cosmic entity in disguise.
Wait a minute!
And argued that traditional religious figures are just multidimensional archetypes playing a game of consciousness with humanity. She has an origin story that is so bad it feels completely immune to criticism. But if you look at what actually happened to her, it doesn't line up. Her entire brand authority is anchored in the fact that she had a very traumatic childhood in Utah where she was abducted and subjected to 13 years of horrific ritualistic abuse, physical torture, and blood sacrifice by an underground satanic cult. Keep in mind, she's during the 1980s Satanic Panic. That is where we saw the recovered memory therapy become popular, and that is what she uses. It's very fishy. Anyways, she has gone on the record with these shocking claims stating that her childhood mentor physically sewed her inside a human corpse for 12 hours straight and forced her to watch him eat a dead man's thigh muscle. Law enforcement and independent investigative journalists have audited her background and found no physical evidence, no missing persons links, no corroborating family records, and no police trails to support the existence of any of this flesh-eating cult operating in her hometown. But again, her story perfectly mirrors the Satanic Panic that swept North America in the 1980s, where unverified memories were systematically manufactured through controversial hypnotic regression. Journalists and Reddit users tracked the exact origins of her memories, and they found a huge plot twist. When Teal Swan first went to the police in Utah in 2005 to support these blood sacrifice claims, she was being actively treated by a therapist named Barbara Snow. Why does that name matter? Well, Barbara Snow was a notorious figure who had been at the center of several aggressive satanic panic allegations in Utah during the 1980s and helped to manufacture identical false memories in children during heated divorce and custody battles. There was somebody on Reddit who summarized this perfectly. Quote, "The absolute craziest detail about the cult backstory is that Teal's original therapist was Barbara Snow, the architect of the Satanic Panic. Teal isn't just making this stuff up for clicks, she was actually a victim of extreme psychological malpractice. Her therapist brainwashed her into believing these horror stories happened to her when she was a teenager, and now Teal is using those same broken regression techniques to brainwash a whole new generation of followers on YouTube." End quote. She convinces her followers she survived literal cannibalism, and if she can integrate that level of horror, any follower who complains about their own trauma is just simply too weak or too resistant to do the work. Quote, "When she starts talking about her childhood mentor eat a dead man's thigh muscle, the energy in the room completely drops. It paralyzes the audience. You are sitting there with your own minor anxieties or family issues, and she presents herself as someone who conquered literal demonic ghouls. It creates this toxic psychological barrier. Nobody dares to question her authority or her methods, because how could you possibly criticize someone who survived literal cannibalism? It completely silences any intellectual pushback." End quote. Another user added, quote, "I used to listen to her videos for basic relationship advice, but then she dropped an episode where she casual veered into her childhood backstory. The second she claimed a network of local Mormons sewed her into a human corpse, my jaw hit the floor. It mirrored the falsified, unhinged claims of the 1980s Satanic Panic and made me realize that either she's a phenomenal liar or she is deeply unwell and completely detached from reality." There was an interview on the Mormon Stories podcast where Teal's closest childhood friend, Diana Hansen Ribera, who spent every day with Teal for 14 years growing up in Utah, came forward and dismantled her origin story. She said that during the exact years Teal claimed she was being pimped out at gas stations, locked in cages, and sewn into corpses, Teal was actually living a normal life focused on modeling, horse riding, and just hanging out at her house with Diana and her other friends. Diana noted that the first time she had ever heard about this alleged lifelong horrific abuse was in a bizarre, unexpected email Teal sent her years later in 2010. Do you think she really believes her own narrative, or is there some deeper motivation? Most profilers and clinical psychologists who study high-control group leaders argue that she likely does actually believe her own narrative, at least on some psychological level. In cases of severe malignant narcissism and histrionic personality disorder, the line between objective reality and internal fantasy just dissolves. And for a personality like Teal's, the ego cannot survive being seen as ordinary. And so the mind constructs a narrative where she was the ultimate victim of cosmic, cartoonish evil. And it gets two jobs done. The first is that it explains away any of her real-world behavioral issues as just a product of trauma. And the second is it elevates her status to supernatural survivor who cannot be questioned. Let's talk about her retreat and her monetization funnel. Her online streaming content and localized workshops cost around $100 a ticket, but in order to fully ascend the corporate ladder and achieve true spiritual validation, followers are told that they should go to the week-long curveball retreat at the Philia Center, which slaps desperate attendees with an astonishing $5,000 admission fee per person, and that excludes flights and travel costs. Fragile individuals who are already drowning in debt or spending their final emergency reserves that they could have spent on real therapy are told by leadership that if they hesitate to purchase this premium tier, they are resisting their own healing and choosing to stay spiritually broken. Now, the fact that this is taking place all the way in Costa Rica is a high control feature to isolate the individual from their family, their friends, and their job. And by doing that, you erase their ability to check their reality against any world but yours. Former attendees, ex-staffers, and independent journalists who spent a week on site describe Philia not as an oasis of calm, but as an intense, hyper-isolated corporate startup where the product is just emotional, raw energy. Multiple testimonies from former students note that the physical setup of the remote Costa Rican estate breaks down self-trust. One survivor said, quote, "You are broken down so thoroughly under that jungle canopy that you lose all trust in your own sanity. When you reach that level of absolute terror, you look at Teal as the only savior who can put you back together. It isn't healing, it's a systematic transfer of your personal sovereignty directly to her brand," end quote. Another shared, "I was sitting in a room at Philia where a woman was hyperventilating, crying, and screaming out in agony. It looked less like a spiritual retreat and more like a medical triage, except there were no actual doctors or licensed psychiatrists anywhere in the building to pull her back to reality." At the Philia Center, every part of daily life, what you consume, when you sleep, who you converse with, how you interpret your own internal thoughts, is governed by the collective culture of Teal's estate. Former members and media audits have detailed that an intense level of behavioral modification is required. Eating is treated as a moral and vibrational metric rather than a physical necessity. Management closely tracks what goes into your body. If a staff member or attendee suffers from low energy, digestive issues, or chronic fatigue, the community culture dictates that mindless snacking or eating specific foods is a subconscious attempt to suppress or buffer facing your childhood shadow work, and that is what is causing those symptoms. Your diet becomes a public indicator of your spiritual obedience. Someone at the retreat said, "Everything you put in your mouth is scrutinized. If you feel tired or want a snack out of the collective mealtimes, it's analyzed in front of everyone. You're told you're not actually hungry, you're just using food to numb yourself so you don't have to face your shadow work. It makes you second guess your own basic bodily signals." Even the clothing is vetted to ensure that it matches the high vibrational presentation of Teal Swan's global brand. If you wear something too dark or unkept or outside of the aesthetic, you're criticized in group meetings as having an outward reflection of a resistant, chaotic internal state. A member said that the clothing worn by the inner circle is heavily vetted. Everything has to look clean, highly aesthetic, and visually aligned with the brand's premium digital image. If someone shows up in casual, worn-out clothing or looks unkempt due to exhaustion, it's brought up as a public sign that their internal energy is resistant and chaotic. The reality is that Teal Swan even uses her attendees in Costa Rica for free labor, employing spiritual and psychological abuse and sleep deprivation to keep them going. Instead of hiring professionals at standard market rates, the organization populates its staff with Teal's devoted followers. Multiple former inner circle workers have come forward exposing they were forced to work grueling 60 to 80-hour work weeks under extreme psychological stress for little to no financial compensation. When exhausted staff raised questions about their salaries or fair pay, the leadership weaponized shadow work against them, declaring that their desire for money was toxic greed from an unevolved ego. Her followers' deep childhood trauma was used as corporate leverage to extract millions of dollars in free labor to fund Teal's high-consumption lifestyle and her luxury wardrobe and elite global travel itinerary. This is what a former staff member said, quote, "The media pipeline never sleeps because we had to constantly edit, translate, and upload videos to hit the top of search algorithms globally. We were routinely pushed into 14 to 16-hour workdays that stretched long into the night only to be woken up at dawn for intensive emotional processing or mandatory group meditations. When you are chronically sleep deprived and doing deep hyperventilation exercises every day, your critical thinking just shuts down and you become hypersuggestible and rely completely on Teal's voice to tell you what reality is." Another added, "People are giving up their apartments, their savings, and their independent lives to move to Costa Rica because they think they're building a new world. But the second you get there, you realize you're an unpaid employee for a multi-million-dollar startup. If you complain about the cost or needing money, they tell you you have a financial blockage because you don't trust the universe." Teal publicly preaches an anti-capitalist, egalitarian lifestyle where everything is shared equally inside of a communist-style community. But her financial ledger says differently. Teal charges followers hundreds of dollars for books and lectures and master classes and markets herself as a hyper-perceptive master of human connection. In reality, her personal inner circle operates like a revolving door of messy legal collapses. She has married and divorced multiple times in rapid succession to men who were initially her followers or staff members. Survivors point out that typically she'll absorb her romantic partner into her corporate business structure, transform them into an administrative asset, and then the second they exhibit boundaries or workplace burnout, will publicly pathologize them in front of the community, divorce them, and scrub them. Teal Swan was exposed in the major investigative documentary series in 2022 titled The Deep End. There was a sequence where a high-level inner circle staff member named Meg expressed minor burnout, independent thought, and brief hesitation regarding the group's corporate direction. And instead of offering standard professional support, Teal initiated a brutal psychological audit in front of the entire boardroom. Meg sat in a chair while Teal and the rest of the team systematically picked apart her personality, accusing her of harboring hidden, unintegrated childhood trauma, labeling her workplace fatigue as an existential threat to the global mission of the company. They told her, "You aren't tired because we work you 80 hours a week for no money. You're tired because you haven't faced your inner demons." It is the ultimate form of emotional gaslighting, and it forces Meg, or the worker, to take 100% of the blame for their own exploitation. What blew my mind about the footage was that Teal didn't have to do any of the heavy lifting herself. Other inner circle members jumped in to prove their own loyalty by tearing Meg's personality to shreds. They conditioned the inner circle to police each other. If you don't participate in breaking down the person in the hot seat, you're going to be the next one sitting in it. It was a masterclass in using emotional gaslighting to enforce administrative compliance. Teal Swan International launched a media damage control campaign after this came out. She claimed that the directors used Franken editing to intentionally manufacture a high-control villain narrative for Hollywood entertainment values. She shifted her branding into a victimhood stance and told her followers that mainstream media and the multi-million-dollar entertainment conglomerate were executing a coordinated hit piece on her because her revolutionary healing methods directly threatened the massive profits of the capitalistic pharmaceutical and psychiatric industries. Teal Swan's organization is absolutely a cult. It meets every criteria of a cult. Teal, of course, is the unassailable, charismatic leader who cannot do any wrong and claims absolute supernatural authority. There's a demand for us versus them. She clearly tries to isolate her followers from the world and tells them their biological families are toxic roadblocks to their evolution. She severs their trust in secular therapy, mainstream doctors, and so she is socially and environmentally isolating them, where her reality is the only reality available. She exhibits physical control with her retreat in Costa Rica, controlling their sleep cycles and having them work 14 to 16-hour days. She shows financial control by not paying her staff fairly, by accusing her staff when they need money of having a greedy, unevolved ego. Okay, so there are a few things that we can do to make sure that people like Teal Swan don't end up hurting more people. The first is that life coaching is entirely unregulated and literally anyone can print out a PDF certificate, launch a program, claim they are certified. I think that state legislators need to rewrite scope of practice laws to establish clear boundaries defining exactly what coaching looks like when it crosses the line into trying to be medical treatment. If an unlicensed coach uses trauma regression techniques or attempts to diagnose psychological blocks, then state medical boards would have the teeth to shut them down instantly for the unlicensed practice of mental health therapy. Federal Trade Commission regulatory bodies should update digital advertising and consumer protection guidelines to audit keywords. A lot of Teal Swan's followers found her when they were Googling how to fix their problems at the darkest, worst parts of their lives. And so I think that legislation could mandate that terms like severe trauma or I want to die, they must prioritize public health resources and clinical hotlines and the results rather than Teal Swan's videos, no matter how much Teal Swan pays in advertising money. Teal Swan and other high control groups will shield themselves by structuring their organizations as private LLCs and forcing the participants to sign liability disclaimers. State insurance commissioners could fundamentally restructure how professional liability and errors and omissions insurance applies to the wellness industry. So if an organization wants to sell multi-$1,000 retreats that feature intense somatic processing or physical restraint, state laws could require them to carry liability insurance. Now, insurance providers refuse to cover high-risk unverified practices like water drowning or physical swaddling, which would make it uninsurable and financially impossible to run. Mandatory reporter laws should include high-ticket spiritual retreat centers and alternative wellness communities. This way, if somebody at a retreat center witnesses a client in an active psychotic break or exhibiting self-harm or recounting severe abuse involving an elder or somebody who's disabled or a child, they would be legally required by secular law to report the crisis to emergency medical services, and that would strip the guru of their internal authority to use this information to control people. Your trauma belongs to you. Your healing is your own journey, and you do not need to sign over your mental sovereignty to Teal Swan just to find some peace. Let's end with some positive news to make sure that we don't all walk out of here feeling hopeless. In a historic victory for child safety and institutional transparency, Washington State passed Senate Bill 5375, which added clergy members to the list of legally mandated reporters of abuse. And so this finally eliminated the confessional privilege, and legally, religious leaders and elders are required to report harm to law enforcement, even if the information is obtained during a confidential religious rite. This is a great precedent because it declares that no private, corporate, or religious shield can legally sit above human protection. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Do You Want to Hear Something Awful? Feel free to follow us on social media, follow our podcast, give us a rating if you liked this and want to hear more episodes like this, and come back if you want to hear more awful things. We will see you next time.